In the mid-20th century, New York City was a dense, moving machinery. The streets were packed with thousands of ordinary routines, providing the perfect cover for a deeply embedded public threat. For 16 years, a phantom identifying himself only as FP used those crowds to slip small, gunpowder-packed wooden boxes into the city's most prominent public spaces: movie theaters, phone booths, and the echoing halls of Grand Central Terminal. These devices rarely killed anyone, but fatalities were entirely beside the point. The explosions were designed to weaponize paranoia. They ensured that anyone sitting next to you in a darkened theater could be a monster hiding in plain sight. By 1956, after 32 bombs and over a decade of exhaustive searching, the New York City police had reached an absolute dead end. They had recovered unexploded devices and angry letters, but they had no fingerprints, no identifiable face, and no solid leads. The sheer panic of a metropolis paralyzed by an ordinary-looking phantom created a vacuum. Traditional police work had hit a wall, leaving investigators desperate enough to seek answers outside of law enforcement entirely. A frustrated homicide inspector eventually handed the cold case files to a civilian, psychiatrist James Brussel. Brussel didn't search the evidence for physical clues to match against police records. Instead, he treated the crime scene as a psychological reflection of the bomber, reading the construction of the explosives as a confession of the man's personality. He handed the police a detailed portrait, culminating in an incredibly specific guarantee. When they finally caught the bomber, he would be wearing a double-breasted suit, and it would be buttoned. In January 1957, detectives knocked on the door of George Metesky, a mild-mannered former clerk in Connecticut. He calmly admitted to being the phantom. Metesky politely asked to go change his clothes before heading to the station. When he emerged, he was wearing exactly what Brussel had predicted: a fully fastened, double-breasted suit. To the press and the public, this staggeringly precise coincidence functioned as absolute proof. It looked as though the human mind could be charted like a map, provided you had the right expert holding the compass. That single buttoned suit became the origin story for an entire investigative discipline. It laid the immediate groundwork for modern criminal profiling and the behavioral science units at the FBI. Brussel's framework relied on a specific kind of deductive logic. He took a physical clue, like the tidy, careful construction of a wooden box bomb, and mapped it directly to a psychological trait, interpreting it as a strict need for order. He applied the same reverse engineering to the timeline. The bomber's letters referenced a grievance with Con Edison starting in 1931. Assuming the suspect had to be an adult to form that grudge, Brussel estimated his current age to be in his 50s. Even his demographic guesses followed this logic. The formal, stiff phrasing and careful block lettering of the threat notes pointed Brussel toward an older, foreign-born suspect of Slavic descent. There was no supernatural mind-reading occurring in his office. Brussel was formalizing a new system of reading behavior backward to construct a human being out of the debris they left behind. But if you look closely at Brussel's actual notes, the illusion starts to crack. While he nailed the suit, he was completely wrong about many other details, including his firm guess that the bomber was Roman Catholic. This diagram illustrates a psychological trap called confirmation bias. When presented with a massive list of predictions, our brains immediately light up at the successful hits, quietly erasing the failures from our memory. Experienced observers also rely on safely vague phrasing. A broad description can encompass multiple different outcomes, feeling incredibly precise only after a suspect is caught and the pieces are fit together in hindsight. The legend of the infallible profiler took hold because we crave a clean, solvable narrative. Our desperation for answers forces us to remember the dazzling suit and ignore the deeply flawed science behind it. When researchers finally tested these methods with hard data, the results were sobering. Extensive reviews found that 60% of profiling literature relies on anecdote rather than empirical evidence, and trained profilers often barely outperform ordinary people. Critics point to a logical flaw they call the Sherlock Holmes effect. In fiction, a detective can look at a scuffed shoe and perfectly deduce a suspect's occupation because an author guarantees the outcome. Reality doesn't have an author arranging the clues. In the real world, physical evidence is inherently ambiguous. A single disorganized crime scene could point to a suspect acting in a panic, one who was interrupted, or one who simply didn't care. Three entirely contradictory psychological interpretations drawn from the exact same room. This is the core danger of the Sherlock trap. When a theatrical flourish of deduction is mistaken for empirical evidence, an entire investigation is compromised. Used as a rough tool on a detective's notepad to prioritize leads, a psychological profile can be helpful. The problem arises when that same profile is delivered from a witness stand, dressed up in the absolute certainty of scientific expertise. A vivid, confident profile has the power to harden a bad hunch into an undeniable fact, pointing investigators toward the wrong type of person and potentially sending an innocent human being to prison. The legacy of George Metesky's buttoned suit leaves us with a difficult truth. Human behavior does leave traces, and those traces can be read, but that reading is always an act of probability. The scariest thing we can encounter is an expert who convinces us it is a prophecy.